about the third unit here, the third conversation, I want us to talk a little bit more and think a little bit more about how certain kinds of class disparities are evident in the readings, but also what kinds of things did the civil rights movement do to try to address those asymmetries of power between the black elite and the black poor. Now, part of what's important to think through with the civil rights movement is the question of how progressive of a movement it could be at particular points in time. As you think about the Montgomery bus boycott and how it was an effort to kind of push and force the needle around desegregation and the use of segregated transportation in major American cities, understand that there are also a series of movements. Really, the civil rights movement can be understood as a movement of movements. You have nonviolent direct action, you have assertions of black self-determination, you have labor activism, you have movements in the courts, and all of these are part of creating a national debate and a national revolution in many respects. In the wake of the Brown decision, Southerners are trying a variety of different approaches to try to stop segregation from moving forward. They draft the Southern Manifesto and talking about the constitutionality of preserving Jim Crow. There are efforts to try to write watered-down versions of civil rights legislation that leave things merely at the level of discussion and conversations, not at the level of redistributing goods and resources and wealth in this country. It's also important to keep in mind that there are very real class divides, that as people are making the distinctions about civil rights and voting rights and property rights, that there are going to be all kinds of cross-sections cutting across what becomes acceptable Negro politics, and particularly in the urban South. Now, just to be very brief about this, in order to understand what we now take as a given, which is that America is a liberal society that has a liberal democracy, it's important to understand liberalism and what liberalism effectively means. Liberalism is a political idea, philosophy, that depends on the preservation of individual rights and the use of contract in order to ensure that goods and services are moved smoothly and justly. And the courts are there to make sure that contracts are enforced. The state is there in its monopoly on violence to make sure that contracts are enforced legally. But the contract really is at the foundation of this. And so much of what is going into liberalism in the 20th century is about trying to find ways of expanding contract rights and allowing people to enter into actual contracts, but also the social contract of America. So there are efforts to push for greater public accommodations, use of public land and parks. There are ways in which people are trying to make it possible for black folk to testify and serve on juries in courts as citizens. When people are paying their property taxes, they're entering into a contract with their local government that says, I'm giving you a percentage of my money for goods and services to which I should then be able to benefit or have access to. And this was a critical argument in the Jim Crow period, where you had property owners, you had organizations, business organizations, you had lawyers who were constantly using the contract law under the Constitution as a way to push for civil rights. And so what this means is the contract is considered to be a vessel of progressive action, but it also makes a lot of what goes into progressive struggle conservative at its fundamental level, right? So it's not about creating broad access, but it's about simply allowing individual access on a broad basis, right? Individual contract here, individual contract there, in that house, be able to access that amenity, and so on and so on and so forth. This is going to put the lion's share of authority in the hands of black elites who are in positions to make aggressive pushes for things like days on the golf courses, access to hotels, certain kinds of restaurants and public accommodations. So much of what you might recall from your own, knowledge of the civil rights movement has to do with dollar-based social justice movements, right? If I bring my money to a lunch counter, I should be able to purchase, a meal because I have the entitlement to do that. Just think about scaling that up, not just about somebody with enough money in their back pocket for a hamburger, but someone who wants to stay at a beachfront hotel in the coastal area of South Carolina or in Florida or in Georgia, or somebody who wants to fly first class on a plane ticket or ride in a first class car on a train. Right? This is part of what becomes the dominant thrust around desegregation, is accessing consumer rights. Consumer rights. In the mid part of the 20th century, you have an entire history of housing segregation, redlining, New Deal policy that's in place to make it challenging for people of color to access single-family homes. All the while, white Americans are enjoying 98% of the benefits of federally subsidized single-family home mortgage insurance. Over 12.5 million people who are of a white, discernible white background are moving to the suburbs during the 1960s, during the high watermark of the civil rights movement. Under 1 million African Americans are living in what we would call suburban housing at that time. And so there's 12 million to less, over 12 million to less than 1 million, just to give you a sense of the disparity there. So all of this is going to shape how the civil rights struggle is being articulated and what are the things that are being put forward. Similarly, and this is an important thing to consider just as we think about why someone like Whitney Young is making the arguments he's making in the National Observer piece about economic justice, the question then becomes, what do we do with the black poor? What kinds of protections are going to be available to them? Do we guarantee them some kind of government employment? Do we find ways of enforcing, job, anti-discrimination measures? Do we look at different kind of tenant protections? And so much of what becomes the fissure that the National Observer piece talks about is actually about whether or not you have a civil rights movement that's most attendant to the needs of the black poor. There are questions of voting rights that are on the table more for the black poor than they are for other parts of the black elite who can have other levers of political power, right? So this becomes a very important point where the mid-1960s is a real fissure. What does it mean to have voting rights? How do you measure political voice? And in many respects, is it possible even to organize politically those people who might belong to the black underclass or the so-called lumpen proletariat in the language of the left of the country into late 1960s? What do you do with the people who are seemingly, the undeserving poor? How do you organize them? This becomes a fundamental challenge, and you'll notice as well from the King piece on the last steep ascent that this is one of the most fundamental elements for what the civil rights movement is attempting to move forward even after the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965.